Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. Welcome to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's virtual event on the dangers of the current policy baseline gimmick. With the House and the Senate passing vastly different budget resolutions, lawmakers are now working to figure out how to reconcile the differences. One of the biggest issues emerging from these negotiations is whether to use a current law or current policy baseline. This issue is a technical one, but the consequences of the decisions are huge. I'm dropping a link in the chat right now to the newest piece that the committee has written on this topic. Also, throughout the discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions that I will then use to ask the panel after they complete their introductions. And we have a really great panel of experts joining us today. I'm going to introduce them very briefly in order in the order in which you will be hearing from them. Up first will be Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President and Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Following Marc will be George Callas, Executive Vice President of Public Finance and Arnold Ventures. Then we will hear from Bobby Kogan, Senior Director of Federal Budget Policy at American Progress. And then finally, we will be hearing from Romina Boccia, Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute. It is now my pleasure to turn over the discussion to Marc.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As you can tell from the title of this talk that uses words like gimmick and dangers, we're no fans of the current policy baseline. And I think you're going to hear from an ideologically diverse panel here about all of our concerns. But I want to start by setting the stage and explaining exactly what the heck is going on here, right? So it's important to understand that when Congress is doing tax legislation, or when they're doing legislation related to mandatory spending, things are scored by the Congressional Budget Office and others relative to what's called a current law baseline. The basic idea is the CBO will project 10 years forward what is going to happen under the law, and then they will project what will happen under the change. And the cost of a policy is the difference between the borrowing under the change and the borrowing under the law. Now, the way that CBO sets up its baseline as starting point, they call it current law. It's actually a little more complicated. It doesn't strictly adhere to current law. For example, it doesn't assume that we stop borrowing when we hit the debt limit in a few months. But when there is any kind of deviation from current law, it's generally set in advance and it's consistent over time. So we always treat it the same way, as you'll hear from the other panelists. Unfortunately, Congress is now endeavoring to try to add a tremendous amount of money to the debt, but they don't want to admit it. And they've found what they think might be a workaround, the so-called current policy baseline, where they can pretend that adding to the debt doesn't actually cost anything. In short, large parts of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts, large parts are scheduled to expire at the end of this year. That was how it was originally written. And extending them, depending on the details, could cost $3 to $5 trillion, $3 to $4 trillion through 2034, more if we go over time. By adopting a quote unquote current policy baseline that assumes they're already extended, those costs appear to go away. Now, this doesn't change the underlying costs, it just changes how they're reported. But in addition, it unlocks the door to extending that debt over the long term, because various budget rules actually prevent long-term increases in the debt. Now, if we were to move forward with this current policy baseline right off the bat, that would add, again, at least $3.5 trillion to the debt from just extending these expiring tax cuts. They also assumed the expiration of various other expiring things like Obamacare credits, which could be at $4 trillion. And then there's talk of actually using what I can only describe as a prior policy baseline that would actually bring back corporate provisions as they were in 2021. That's where you can start getting that cost really high. We already, as people have heard from me before, have a tremendous debt problem, with debt at 100% of GDP today, headed to a record 118% by the end of the decade. This current policy baseline would kind of almost double that growth, up to 130 through to 2034 and more beyond that. So it significantly increased the debt. And I think what you'll hear from the other panelists, starting with George, why this might be particularly concerning from a fiscal, from a tax policy standpoint. So George, do you want to jump on in?
Sure. Thanks, Marc. Great to be here, and I'll try to pick up where Marc left me. So yeah, let's go back, rewind the clock back to 2017. At the time, I was serving as senior tax counsel to then Speaker Paul Ryan, and so was very heavily involved in the negotiations on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back then. And I think some of the history here is very important for thinking through these choices that people are contemplating in 2025. Back then, concerns about the deficit were not as strong as they are today. The deficit picture was not quite, it was bad. It wasn't quite as bad. Inflation was much lower, interest rates were much lower, but there was still heartburn about a deficit increase. I apologize if you can hear there's a bunch of emergency vehicles with sirens outside my window. There was still a heartburn about a deficit number that was too big. And there were a great deal of negotiations during the course of 2017. And that all ended up with the number 1.5 trillion, a $1.5 trillion instruction to the tax writing committees, Ways and Means in the House, Finance in the Senate, because there was not the support for a net tax cut or a net deficit increase larger than $1.5 trillion over the 10-year window. At the time, that 10-year window is 2018 through 2027. Specifically, Senator Bob Corker at the time was a member of the Senate Budget Committee, a Republican member, and the Republicans only had a one-vote margin on the Budget Committee, and so his opposition could have blocked any budget resolution. He was not willing to go higher than a 1.5 trillion over 10 years. So that's what we had to work with. As the legislation moved through the process, and I'll fast forward a little bit, that was always kept in mind. And when the Senate was moving its version of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Senate made a decision, which the House ultimately acceded to in conference negotiations, that as part of not exceeding the $1.5 trillion deficit limit, that many of the provisions, particularly the individual provisions, the non-corporate provisions, and this includes both tax cuts and the revenue raisers, the offsets, would be set to expire after 8 years. By having them expire after 8 years, they appeared to cost less than they otherwise would have if they had been permanent. And that allowed us to get below the $1.5 trillion limit. I think the final score was like 1.46 trillion. But the fact that, in effect, there was little or no score in the last 2 years of the budget window, 2026 and 2027, had it been permanent, it would have added at least a couple $100 billion, if not several $100 billion to the score. And so you can see from the math, there's no way we could have complied with the $1.5 trillion maximum deficit increase that politically was the most Congress was willing to do. And so that led to a decision to have a bunch of provisions expire after 8 years. They were scored as expiring after 8 years. They were not scored as if they were permanent. So now you fast forward to 2025. Well, guess what? The budget window we're talking about is 2025 to 2034. Those same 2 years, 2026 and 2027, where those tax cuts were effectively not scored back in 2017, are part of the budget window still right now. And so if you switch to a current policy baseline where you assume that extending the expiring provisions doesn't have a cost, well, that would mean the cost would be zero in 2026 and 2027. And so neither in 2017 nor in 2025 would hundreds of billions of dollars of costs be accounted for just in those 2 years alone. Both scores would effectively ignore it. And I think, that's kind of, other than the precedent this would send, because clearly Democrats are going to win elections in the future and could easily apply the same rule to temporary spending. Beyond that, I think, one of my biggest concerns is not a current policy baseline conceptually, but the cherry picking and the inconsistency of using current law on the front end, assuming things will expire, and then using current policy on the back end assuming they were always permanent to begin with and therefore don't cost anything. That is not how anything has ever been scored before, and it would set quite a precedent that would, frankly, kind of eviscerate the discipline that the budget rules currently impose on Congress. With that, I will, in kind of fulfilling Marc's earlier comment about ideological diversity, I will turn things over to my ideologically diverse colleague, Bobby Kogan, to continue the conversation.
Thanks, George. Sure, I am ideologically diverse. I served in the staff of the Senate Budget Committee under Patty Murray and then Bernie Sanders, and then worked for Biden. So ideologically diverse from George. My job in the Senate Budget Committee was to be the scorekeeper. My job was to understand how CBO and JCT scoring works and to go through budget concepts and make sure that I understood exactly why the scores work the way that they are. So I'm going to make 2 points here. Number one, I'm going to describe how this is a partway on the path to effectively nuking the filibuster, and then I'm going to hit on George's point that he made earlier that this is actually unique treatment in the budget, contrary to what you might hear. So the first part's actually quite easy. You can do whatever you want as long as the Constitution says you can. You can do whatever you want as long as you have 60 votes in the Senate, right? There are no prohibitions on what sort of legislation Congress can pass other than the Constitution. But in the Senate, there's a special rule that as long as you follow the rules of reconciliation, you can do it with 51 votes instead of 60. Now, of course, if you go nuclear on the filibuster, you can do whatever you want with 51. But otherwise, the only way to get to do 51 is to follow specific rules. Well, the point of current policy is to get to avoid some of those rules. That's it, right? The purpose is to avoid some of the rules. So if the only reason you get to do 51 is you have to stick to the rules and you get to avoid the rules, then that is partway in the path to nuking the filibuster. That one's pretty straightforward. What's more complicated, and apologies, I've given this speech a handful of times. I haven't found a way to make it not to make it super clear. So apologies. And happy to field questions kind of to clarify, but I'm going to try to explain why this is actually unique. You will hear from folks that spending is on a current policy basis. Scoring spending is always done on current policy. Scoring revenues is done on current law. So all folks are seeking is kind of equal treatment. They just want revenue to be treated the same way spending is. And that turns out to not be true. I don't think anyone actually delivering that line is doing it maliciously. I don't think anyone is trying to be misleading. I think it comes from lack of education in this area. But again, this was my job, so I'm going to explain why it's unique here. There are a few programs that are scored on a current policy basis, despite being in the current law baseline. It's about 3% of mandatory spending is temporary, but nonetheless assumed to continue. It's also about 1% of revenue. So it is not the case that spending gets one treatment and revenue gets a different treatment. There's actually some revenue and some spending, but not very much of either. But the key part here is that for those few programs, they still nonetheless always have consistent treatment. These are things that have been extended for decades. And the purpose of it is not really to be one time. The purpose is to force Congress to re-up it. So every 5 years we go and re-up it. This is in contrast to something like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security that are roughly on autopilot. These are on autopilot light, but the purpose is to get Congress every 5 years or so to say, well, let's think if we want to tweak it. But as George talked about, the key point of any scoring rule is that all costs are recognized at some point. If you do it permanently, it's all recognized right there. Yeah, not only do you have the 10-year cost, but there's a long-term budget point of order that you also recognize. So you're actually recognizing 5 decades worth of costs right now. Sure, you're only going to see a score for 10 years, and sure, technically there's costs beyond 50 years, but you're basically recognizing 50 years of costs right there. Or you could do something that's always meant to be temporary, and each time you do it, you recognize the cost. But you're always recognizing the cost at some point. You always have to actually recognize it. And what's going on here for TCJA, as George said, you would get to never recognize some of the costs. Not only would you have only recognized 8 years of cost right then, so you would have left off year 9 and 10. You also would have not recognized years 11 through infinity, which have long-term budget points of order that you got to avoid that way. This is in contrast to the current policy treatment that a little bit of revenue and a little bit of spending get. So one of the famous examples is SNAP. SNAP is in the Farm Bill. Actually, all the Farm Bill is basically done on this current policy basis. Um, when you go to re-up SNAP, because it's in the baseline, it's free to re-up exactly the way it is. But the point is, all of those costs have been recognized, and anytime you tweak it, you actually have to recognize all of the costs. So now it's going to get a little confusing, but say you're re-upping it for 5 years at a time. And let's say you're going to do 10 billion a year, so it's $50 billion worth of cost for those 5 years. Nonetheless, you actually have to recognize 100 billion of cost. You're not just doing 5 years worth of cost. You are doing the 5 years that you are reauthorizing plus the 5 years to kind of to adjust all the baseline going forward. And it is precisely for that reason why when you come back in year 6, it's free to re-up. The reason it's free in year 6 is that you actually did that cost. You had to deal with that cost even though you did it only on a temporary basis. The equivalent in TCJA would have been, yes, we are technically only doing 8 years worth of TCJA, but we still get dinged for infinity years of TCJA. And now it's free to re-up because we've already recognized the cost. But that's not what we did in TCJA. We turned it off early. We never recognized the cost. And now they want it to be free to continue. That's not the way that SNAP works. And you wouldn't have been able to get that treatment. The one way where you could get that treatment is if you turn it off early and turn the score off early. So imagine a scenario where you're doing a 5 year SNAP re-auth and you do 10 billion a year, but you actually only do that for the first 4 years. In that case, you would only be dinged for 40 billion. But when you get to year 5, even though it's a spending program, and even though it's one of those special spending programs that gets current policy treatment, when you got to year 5, you would not get free treatment. It would not be free to continue. It would not get current policy treatment. You would be dinged if you wanted to re-up it. And this is actually exactly what happened in 2009 in the Recovery Act. Democrats did a temporary SNAP increase. And when Democrats wanted to re-up that, it cost a lot of money because they had not ever been dinged with a full year cost. So that's the way all these programs work. And so what the current policy treatment that some Republicans are asking for TCJA is unique. As George says, nothing is scored that way. That is exactly right. There is not a program in the entire budget that gets this treatment. Again, I think that people pushing this are not trying to be misleading. I think they just don't know that much about how scoring works, but this was my job, so I'm here to tell you that that is wrong. What they're looking for is a giant gimmick that would have allowed them to get away with not just hundreds of billions of dollars within the 2 year window of never having been recognized, but trillions of dollars beyond to avoid both the long-term budget point of order and the bird rule long-term issue. And with that, I pass it over to Romina.
Thanks so much, Bobby. Marc asked me to expand the conversation to put this current policy baseline discussion into a broader context of the propensity for legislators to use accounting tricks to hide the true costs of their policies, and why this practice, if we allow this to continue, will threaten America's fiscal future. Right now, the policy debates that Congress is facing stretch from the debt ceiling, which could be raised in reconciliation, the government funding bill that's debated this week, and of course, the expiration of trillions of dollars in tax cuts and some enhanced Obamacare subsidies that are on the table as part of this House and Senate budget resolution discussion, where the current policy baseline falls that we've discussed at length leading up to this point. Rather than taking responsibility for budget actions that Congress is taking, too many lawmakers are looking for creative accounting measures to obscure the real fiscal impact of those choices. One of the most egregious examples we just discussed is the adoption of a current policy baseline, but this is not the only gimmick that's currently on the table. It's just one of many other tactics that are included to hide the cost of these policy choices. Another one is waiving, as Bobby mentioned, the budget rule meant to keep deficits in check. Congress waived that rule in 2017 to allow for 1.5 trillion in deficit increases from the enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we're now talking about extending. And a similar waiver is included in the budget resolutions to enable deficit finance tax cuts and new spending measures that the Trump administration has asked for. This perverts the reconciliation process, which is intended to fast track legislation to reduce, not increase deficits. Republicans in the House, in their resolution, are also assuming excessive economic growth to justify their budget proposal. The House budget resolution claims $2.6 trillion in savings from economic growth, but these projections are, put it lightly, extremely optimistic. To put it more bluntly, it is reckless to assume sustained 3% economic growth will materialize from temporary tax cuts that are not offset with commensurate spending reductions, especially with a debt at 100% of GDP. And as Marc mentioned, rising quickly to dangerous levels. I believe debt is already crowding out private sector investment and will drag down economic growth. And using a current policy baseline to extend these tax cuts and spending provisions will drag down economic growth even more. Meanwhile, the budget calls for $300 billion in increased defense, border security, and immigration enforcement spending, a priority for President Trump, but using reconciliation to now increase what should be discretionary spending that should be negotiated as part of the appropriations process. Those are the discussions taking place in Congress this week to avoid a government shutdown. Instead, Republicans are looking at increasing what should be discretionary spending in a process that is supposed to focus on mandatory spending and, again, deficit reduction, but they would use it to increase spending. Meanwhile, real opportunities for fiscal reform are being ignored, with Republicans who've been campaigning on spending and debt reduction in the majority in both the House, Senate, and in charge of the White House. There's no excuse for not pursuing the spending reductions that Republicans have promised. But political courage is once again lacking. The big example here is Medicaid. The reluctance to adopt a current law baseline stems in part from an unwillingness to make necessary Medicaid reductions. And so instead, lawmakers want to rely on a budget gimmick, even though there's bipartisan recognition of Medicaid's inefficiencies. In fact, two of the major reforms on the table that could save $1 trillion more than the House budget resolution asked for would limit the provider, such as limiting the provider tax scam and equalizing reimbursement rates between traditional Medicaid enrollees, such as children, seniors, and people with disabilities, and so-called expansion enrollees, primarily able-bodied adults. These major reforms were even included in President Obama's budget proposals. So there's no excuse for Republicans not to enact these changes now that they're in the majority. Another ripe area for reform, it doesn't have to be all spending cuts. Instead of playing budget games, Congress could eliminate wasteful tax expenditures. The tax code is riddled with examples of spending through the tax code. For instance, repealing electric vehicle subsidies could save $224 billion over the next decade, while eliminating state and local tax deductions for so-called C corporations could generate up to $800 billion in revenue, while equalizing the tax treatment across smaller pass-through businesses and these C corporations. Beyond these examples, lawmakers may rely on other timing gimmicks to create a misleading budget projection, expiring provisions such as the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we're talking about today, delayed implementation dates, for example, for spending cuts that could then later be reversed. And overall, backloading costs are all ways that Congress has in the past made legislation appear less costly than it actually is. The important thing to keep in mind is that these tactics do not change the underlying fiscal reality. America's national debt is already as large as our economy and rising, and relabeling deficits as if they didn't exist will still add to those deficits and debt. So every dollar that Congress manages to add to deficits through deceptive accounting today is a dollar that will add to the burden, the very real burden confronted by younger generations tomorrow. So my appeal to especially Republicans who are in charge of this process right now is that with interest costs in excess of what the nation spends on defense, lawmakers must get serious now about fiscal responsibility and stop hiding behind gimmicks and start making the necessary choices to rein in deficits and debt. Or if they lack the political courage, then delegate the responsibility to a fiscal commission so we can get this job done. Thank you for being here today and sticking with our wonky discussion, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, everyone. If we're going to have everybody turn their cameras back on now, so we're all joined together, and we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. There's been a lot of questions, which is excellent. Lots of really wonky questions, some clarifying questions. So first, I'm going to start off with Bobby, who had a question from Ian asking if you can clarify what it means to recognize a cost.
Sure, I just mean that all costs are supposed to be scored at some point. Congress is allowed to increase deficits if it feels like it, obviously. There are points of order against increasing budget. The budget resolution will key off a bunch of internal points of order for the Senate, and there's a point of order against spending more than your plan. There's a point of order against losing against not raising as much revenue as your plan. There's pay-go points of order. There are all sorts of points of order, and you are allowed to break them. You're allowed to do whatever you want. But the point is you will be scored, and then you will choose to either adhere to the point of order and not do what you're trying to do. You can try to cure it, or you can waive the point of order. And in either going forward and waiving the point of order or in recognizing it and having your amendment or your bill defeated, you have like fully recognized the cost. Congress is allowed to do whatever it wants, but it is supposed to recognize the cost. It is supposed to see the score of any of its actions. Everything it's supposed to be doing is supposed to be scored at some point. And what is going on here is avoiding the score of congressional actions. And that's why it's a gimmick.
Great. Thank you for that clarification, Bobby. We have a question from Hazen who asks, it was stated that a current policy revenue baseline ignores the deficit impacts of extending the TCJA. Isn't it true that while a TCJA extension wouldn't show up in the scorekeeping tables, its impact on the deficit would be 100% real?
Yeah, I'll answer that and I'll go further. Its impact on the deficit, its impact on the economy, its impact on interest rates, its impact on wage growth, all of that would be real. The fact that CBO gives you a 0 score instead of a $4 trillion score doesn't change the amount that you add to the debt. If you adopt a current policy baseline and then adhere to that baseline, you've added tremendously to the debt. And we've actually looked at this. It might be the thing that kind of pushes us into sort of debt spiral situation where your interest rate is pushed above your growth rate by the end of the decade. The markets don't care if you got there through a score that said 0 or if you got there through a score that said 4 trillion. They care how much debt you're bearing.
I would just add one small point, which is that adhering to a current law baseline right now with the desire to extend to Trump tax cuts actually gives those fiscal conservatives that have been wanting to push for deficit reduction and spending cuts, or at least have claimed to, actually more leverage, because it allows them to say, we agree with the need to extend these tax cuts, but in order to do so, we also need to offset the deficit impact, and we want to do that by reducing spending in those areas of government that we think are wasteful, improper, inefficient, etc. And so if Republicans agree to the current policy baseline, that actually takes that leverage away. Because now you're saying those tax cut extensions are free, and it would be very unwise for Republicans, now that they're in the majority, to vote away their own leverage to make the spending cuts that they've promised for so long.
That's actually a really perfect segue because Tom asked if the GOP goes forward with the current policy baseline, what would you predict the Democrats may use it for in the future, or what may they have already used it for looking backwards? Why don't we start with George on this one?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's where, for, at least from my perspective, my right of center perspective, things start to get really scary. Because it is not true, as some people claim, that this change would just make um, tax cuts score the same as spending. I think Bobby blew that myth out of the water, and he was 100% right. That's simply not true. But if you adopted this current policy baseline now, having used current law in 2017 to hide the costs, um, future Congresses will take that precedent and make the spending rules conform to the tax rules. And what could that mean hypothetically? Okay, let's enact Medicare for all for 1 year and only score it for a 1 year score. And then a year later, let's come back and make it permanent and claim that it costs zero to make it permanent. Or let's do that with a Green New Deal, or let's do that with a universal basic income. Looking back, look at ARP, right? If you believe that temporary spending is assumed to go on forever, you don't have to go back to 2021. All the temporary spending in ARP, pandemic unemployment benefits, state and local aid, et cetera, that was all assumed to expire. And a year later, if the Democrats had wanted to make that stuff permanent and say Build Back Better, they would have had to absorb trillions of dollars of costs. It wouldn't have been free. So, both sort of hypothetically and looking back, you can see some pretty big government programs. I mean, go back to the CARES Act, go back to ARA in 2009, look at some of the temporary, stimulus spending in that bill that maybe was for a year or two. It's not just the 4.5 trillion TCJA extensions that could be wiped off the books. It's literally tens of trillions of spending, future spending and tax cuts that could simply be wiped off the books as Congress, at the end of the day, what's really motivating this, there's always a trade-off. And even if you increase the deficit and you don't pay for something, that's a trade-off. And what this really is, it's an exercise in trying to pretend that there are no trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to this sort of really narrow and a really broad way. The really narrow way is there's some talk of having a current policy baseline. I mentioned this before, that would actually take policies that have not been in effect since 2021 and assume them. And specifically as it relates to research and experimentation amortization, bonus depreciation, these business provisions are basically going back to 2021. Democrats could easily come in and say, well, in 2021, we also had a $3,000 fully refundable child tax credit, a hugely expanded EITC and child care credit, and they wouldn't even be creating any new ground relative to what just happened. In the other extreme, this actually opens the door, depending on how it's done, to going beyond even budgetary things for reconciliation. Because if current policy is adopted by kind of overrule the parliamentarian, you've effectively thrown the bird rule out. And then a future Congress can come in and say, you know what? I know the parliamentarian doesn't think the minimum wage is really budgetary, but I think it is, and I know better. So now we're going to do minimum wage increases on reconciliation. Now we're going to do whatever we want. So this really opens Pandora's box, and it'd be very hard to close it again.
Oh, if the Senate actually overruled the parliamentarian on this, I think that would be the end of the filibuster because, so far the filibuster has been kept to, the nominations in that calendar and not legislation. And this would be, in effect, using the nuclear option for legislative purposes, not just for nominations on the executive calendar. And I think that would be crossing a line there would be no limiting principle after that. The filibuster itself would be gone pretty soon.
That's very interesting, and I wonder then, a few people have asked if the panel has any ideas about how the Senate parliamentarian will view the current policy using the current policy baseline. I don't know if anything has been released on that yet. If you all have any viewpoints on that, or based on what was just said, would that even matter at this point?
Yeah. So I can take this one. So there are kind of two paths to doing it theoretically with the parliamentarian's blessing, and there are three paths to doing it without the parliamentarians' blessing. I'm going to do those latter three really easily, right? You can fire the parliamentarian, you can overrule the parliamentarian, you can ignore the parliamentarian. All of those get you to the same place, which is at the end of the day, we're moving towards like effectively nuking the filibuster once you're just ignoring the rules. But you can fire her, you can ignore her, you can overrule her. There are kind of two paths to doing it where you're trying to get her to agree. The first one is getting her to agree to current law on the merits, current policy on the merits, and then the other is kind of using a trump card, and seeing if she'll agree to that trump card. The first one, which is where you're putting into the budget resolution, you're saying, okay, for this reconciliation bill, we CBO and JCT are going to score using a current policy baseline that looks this way, and we feel pretty darn certain that the parliamentarian's going to say no. Republicans asked the parliamentarian about that in 2017 when they were doing the Trump tax cuts, and she said no. And Democrats asked her about something similar in 2021. They wanted to turn off scorekeeping guideline 14 so that they could get the score benefit of the IRS money. And she said, no, you can't do that. So those are two instances where she has said, no, you can't you can't just change fundamental like baseline mechanics when you're doing scoring. So um, we feel pretty confident that she's gonna continue in that. The other one, and I'm not making this up, Republicans are thinking about using something that would allow them to say that the score is whatever they want it to be. Today the score is blue. Today the score is negative 30 trillion, right? They would use that as a way to implement current policy, but the actual mechanical thing that they're trying to do is have the ability to say, I know that the JCT score officially says 4 trillion, but I have decided that today it saves $30 instead. So there was one question that someone asked her, you say, well, if it's current policy, can't you not do it because there's no score? I just assert there's a score or tweak it a tiny bit and then there is a score, right? Like you can cure any of these. The point is the score is whatever you want it to be. Anything, that's obviously profoundly abusable. Non-scorable things are suddenly budgetary. Um, Things that don't have a score, you assume have a score. Your opposition party has an amendment, and you have just decided. You say, yeah, actually, your amendment costs 80 trillion. It's not allowed. Your team has an amendment that costs money. You say, actually, it saves a bunch of money. It's good, right? Like it would completely destroy any aspect of the budget process that barely still remains anyway. The question about whether that will be allowed, we believe the answer is no. The parliamentarian has in the past basically indicated that she's against using that for to determine committee compliance, and so we believe that she will once again do this. So then that would push you into, well, are you going to ignore her? Are you going to fire her? Are you going to overrule her?
And building off of that, maybe we could hear from Romina. Are there any legal guardrails under reconciliation that could prevent Congress from misusing the current policy baseline, or not really?
See it. Okay. Well, I agree with Bobby that in the end, Congress can do whatever Congress wants. And so some of this is an adherence to norms. And in many cases, we've already lost adherence to many budgetary norms, including back in the 50s, the norm that the federal government shall roughly balance. We have thrown that out the window a long time ago. And so ever since, there's been this march towards an erosion of more and more fiscal norms. And so this would be the next iteration. And in many cases, the question then is, where does it end? So if Congress wants to do something, they can find a way to do it. That is my sense of how our system is set up. There isn't a court that could step in and tell Congress, no, you can't do that. This is also one of the challenges we have as proponents of, say, a Swiss or German style debt brake or balanced budget amendment, that in the end, you're always going to rely on Congress's willingness to do the right thing and to own up in this particular context, the deficit impact of extending the 2017 tax cuts. If Congress is not willing to do that, then they'll find a way to get around it. We also see these budget games on discretionary spending with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, where Congress said one thing, and then we later found out that there were a bunch of side deals that were made between Republicans and Democrats to use loopholes like emergency spending and the rescissions process and changes in mandatory programs to increase spending beyond what they told the American people they had just agreed on. So it comes down to we need to hold legislators accountable, and we need to reinforce those fiscal norms. And I think that's why we're having this conversation today to say that not blowing up the filibuster is a good norm to adhere to that both parties should take an interest in, because the consequences of doing so could be severe, including triggering a fiscal crisis much sooner than we're already expecting one to come.
Great, thank you. Stuart has an interesting question, and I think it might challenge all of you. He says it seems so obvious that using the current policy baseline is a bad idea. Can anybody explain some arguments being used as to how to justify using it?
Just quickly, oftentimes Republicans will say that there's no cost to tax cuts, that there's only a cost to spending, and so you should only have to offset new spending. But anytime you cut taxes, you're just giving money back to the American people where it rightfully belongs, so you don't need to pay for that. And I think that was a line that was more appealing in 2017 when our debt was much, much lower than it is now, and we didn't have the concerns over crowding out and the much bigger potential for a severe fiscal crisis that we have now, where debt is at 100% of GDP and rising rapidly. But that's sort of the framing that conservatives might put on this, to say we don't have to pay for tax cuts because we're just giving people money back.
So
You go,
I'll
Marc.
let Bobby go, okay? Because I'm going to try to do this justice. So first of all, most of the arguments for the current policy baseline are either ill-informed or intentionally misleading, because at the end of the day, everybody's looking for a free lunch, and this is the latest attempt at a free lunch, and it wouldn't be the first attempt either. I think the strongest argument for a current policy baseline is that what they care about as policymakers is how things are changing, right? And so I think the strongest argument is that people are used to this tax code. This is the tax code they have, and that tax code is changing. And so we shouldn't have to pay for stopping it to change, is the argument. What that overlooks is the recognition of cost, which you already heard, but it also overlooks that actually things change all the time in the tax code and the budget. Every year, Social Security benefits get more generous, right? Every year, the child tax credit gets less generous relative to inflation. Things change all the time because that's how we have them scheduled in law. And there are certain sort of biases and decisions in the law, but those were choices that we made. And if we want to change those choices, we need to recognize the fiscal consequences.
Look, I'll do my best to channel viewpoint empathy here as well. I think there are I'll make two different points. One, I think there is legitimate confusion about the way that the current law baseline works for spending. And so I don't think folks are like trying to be misleading here. You just hear a lot of people who say, I actually just like spending gets to work this way, so I should get the same treatment. And if that were true, I think if that were actually true, I think that would be a really strong argument. It's not actually true. But I don't think the people saying that are lying. I think they're just misinformed. There might be some motivated reasoning for them, but I think they're just misinformed. And I think that if that were true, that would actually be a really great argument. It turns out to not be true for the reasons I said earlier. But that is like an argument that people are making with a straight face because they believe the underlying thing that they're saying is true. And then the second point, and I would kind of go with what Marc said here, is that I think the way humans view things is deviation from the status quo. And I don't, so if the Trump tax cuts expire, some people see their taxes go down, some people will see their taxes go up, some people will see their taxes stay the same. But if you, for one of the people who is going to see their taxes go up, if you say to them, well, it was baked into current law, so it doesn't really, that was already going to happen anyway, they won't be happy about that. They'll say, but I'm paying more than I did last year, and I'm really bummed about that. And so I think Congress is a recognition of like we should think about things relative to how they're working right now. And I think that that is actually a totally correct thing for how Congress should approach what they're trying to do. And that's just a separate question from how should we as legislators make sure, not, I'm not a legislator, how should Congress as legislators make sure that they're always accounting for all the costs and make sure that they're doing their budgeting correctly?
Yes, let me just jump in real quick and build on that a little bit. My number one, I don't really object strongly to people using a current policy baseline rhetorically to frame it and express, I feel like taxes, as both Bobby and Marc said, things aren't changing. They're staying the way they've been for years. And so I look at it that way. That's fine. Like, that doesn't bother me a whole lot. It's when you're changing the rules to hide the fiscal impact and how much additional debt the Treasury Department is actually going to have to issue. That's where my objection comes in. And then on top of that, I don't object to a current policy baseline conceptually as long as it's consistently applied, right? The problem isn't a current policy baseline. The problem is toggling back and forth between different baselines for the purpose of political expedience. In this case, using a current law baseline in 2017 to say that, oh, we're only scoring 8 years of tax policy, and it doesn't cost anything after 8 years, and then coming back 8 years later and saying, well, now, even though we used current law 8 years ago, we're going to use current policy now to say it doesn't cost anything to extend that stuff. It's that inconsistency, that toggling back and forth for political reasons of political expediency, that I find to be, unprincipled and not defensible. If in 2017 a current policy baseline had been used, and the TCJA cost, I'm making up numbers here, 1.8 trillion instead of 1.5 trillion, and Congress had said, we're going to write a reconciliation instruction for 1.8 trillion because we're willing to increase the deficit by that amount, and it had scored as 1.8 trillion. And if they had somehow gotten around the long-term bird rule point of order that Bobby talked about, if they got 60 votes to waive that point of order and said, we're not going to worry about that, and it's a 1.8 trillion permanent score, not a 1.5 trillion temporary score, then sitting here today, I might have a very different perspective. I might say, well, you use current policy on the front end, you can use it on the back end. It's a conceptually sound way to measure things if you're using it consistently, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Marc, did you have to jump in on something?
And that's how food stamps work, right? We increase it on the front end. And so if we extend that increase, we don't then recognize the cost. What I wanted to do, because George's toggle point reminds me that there's actually a worse gimmick out here than current policy, which I'm now going to call the infinite toggle current policy, which I'm worried about. And basically, it will work like this. They put in place a current policy baseline to give them a budget number, and then they enact policies temporarily within that number, either the same policies, depending on how they legislate this, or new policies, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, you name it. And they only assume the short-term cost of those policies. So they may, on the one hand, say, well, TCJA is current policy, that's free. On the other hand, we're only going to do 3 years of no taxes on tip and charge ourselves for 3 years. And then 3 years, we're going to come back and say that's current policy. And you could see how they could infinitely do this to expand the number of things that become free. And so sort of that, I'm not ready to warn about that because I'm hoping we don't adopt the current policy baseline, but I do think we need to look out for these double gimmicks, which could make something really bad even much, much worse.
Yeah, do allowing temporary tax cuts or temporary spending increases to expire, does that count as an offset under a current policy baseline? Does that count as deficit reduction under a current policy baseline?
I mean, and that is like the way that the Obama administration like pretended with with the Bush tax cuts, right? The Obama administration went out and said, we are raising taxes on the rich and reducing the deficit. And that was their frame. And so if you go much further, right, George mentioned ARP. Imagine Democrats had done 1 year ARP in 2021, and then imagine, obviously BBB as it was fell apart. But then later that year, and they got scored at 1 year, and then later that year they said actually ARP is now permanent, and so now we have an extra $20 trillion in the baseline, and they say okay, we're turning off ARP now. We're continuing CTC, and we're going to do all of BBB, but we're turning off the rest of it, and so we just reduced the deficit by $15 trillion, and we did BBB, right? Like that would be an insane gimmick. But that's actually what we're talking about here, right? Like that's actually the power that we're talking about.
So I'm glad you brought up, I agree with all that. I'm glad you brought up Obama, because that is also part of the false narrative that has gotten out there. Republicans saying, well, Obama used a current policy baseline in 2013, 2012, 2013, whatever you want to call it. And my response is no. If you go look at the JCT score of that legislation, it was a $3.4 trillion deficit increase. I think it was 3.4. Correct me if I have my number wrong, but my vague recollection is if you made all the Bush tax cuts permanent, it was 4 trillion. They didn't make all of them permanent. It was 3.4 trillion, but for argument's sake, that's probably fine.
We'll save it for the fact checking at the end.
Yes. Obama rhetorically said it's a $600 billion tax increase on high incomes, as Bobby noted, because politically he wanted to be able to tell his base, he wanted to be able to tell progressives, I'm raising taxes on the rich. Again, like as I said before, like I don't really object to that. Like using a current law baseline that says negative 3.4 trillion, and then if rhetorically you want to say, yeah, but we can think of it as raising taxes on the rich by 600 billion. I'm not gonna yell and scream about that. But the rule was current law. Obama did not change the rules that were used to score the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, just to build up on that, because I do want to make sure there's not confusion. There is nothing wrong with showing alternative scenarios to where the budget may be. In fact, those are super useful. And there's not even anything wrong with showing where your legislation would change things relative to one of those alternative scenarios. That can be helpful, not just rhetorically important, that can be helpful, useful information. The problem is when you bring this into the budget rules in order to completely hide the fiscal impact altogether.
So building off that back and forth, have there been any instances in past reconciliation packages using current policy baseline? Is it ever appropriate to do so, in your opinion?
I don't know of a single I mean, I'm always ready to be corrected, but I don't know of a single case ever where there has been a successful change to the baseline baked into any reconciliation bill. And I'm if someone tells me I'm wrong, that would be great information, and I would appreciate your correcting the record.
I'm not aware either. It's Section 257 of Graham-Rudman has the baseline rules modified by BBA 97 in statute, right? These are statutes. I'm not aware of any deviation from those rules since those rules were put in place.
Great. So if the current policy baseline is ultimately used, obviously to the chagrin of everybody on this Zoom right now, are there any reliable ways going forward to track the real debt and deficit of the U.S. government? Any suggestions for how people can try to keep an eye on this?
Using the current policy baseline does not change the amount the tax cuts or spending increase or anything contribute to the debt. So the debt will still be recorded as it comes in, and we'll still be able to see how much this costs. CRFB, don't worry, we'll be holding them to account as well others. So the issue isn't the public being able to get the information. The issue is the politicians trying to hide and lie about it and cheat the budget rules.
Yeah, and the issue is politicians setting themselves up to avoid trade-off considerations by pretending like the tax cut extensions are free, which then also frees them from having to find offsetting revenue increases, such as by closing loopholes in the tax code, for example, or offsetting spending reductions, such as the Medicaid debates that are going on right now. So part of this is about holding legislators accountable. And part of it is leverage to actually reduce deficits or not make them much, much worse.
Great. So we're coming up on time, but I wanted to give everybody 1 minute each to kind of do a closing statement before we officially close this out and wrap up. So let's do a reverse order. So let's start with Romina this time.
The United States debt is too high and growing too fast, with the significant risk of either prolonged economic stagnation that will reduce American incomes and opportunities, and it could also lead to civil unrest down the road, or the potential for a massive fiscal crises where Congress may be looking at severe and sudden austerity measures, such as unexpected tax increases, kind of like the uncertainty we're seeing from tariffs right now, but on a much broader scale, and also the potential for government services that are essential to have to be cut all of a sudden, and people's benefits may also be curtailed. So playing games like what we're doing with the budget resolution right now pushes us further down this path. And that's why members of Congress should not just be thinking about how they can extend the tax cuts for the lowest political cost possible, but they also need to keep in mind the long-term implications of the decisions they make today.
Well, I'll just thank everyone for being here. Can't believe, hundreds of people would want to listen to a super wonky niche thing, but it gives me hope. I would just say really fast, like Congress, like I believe in democracy. I believe that Congress should be able to enact its agenda. Congress should be able to do what it wants to do. But we should just be honest about it. If Congress wants to increase deficits, it should increase deficits. If Congress doesn't want to increase deficits, it shouldn't increase deficits. If it wants to lower deficits, it should lower deficits. But we do scorekeeping not as a way to hide what we're doing, but as a way of just making sure we're all thinking about things correctly. This is me doing my nerd glasses thing, but I believe that we should just be honest about what we're doing, and then we should do it. And no matter what that is, that's a fine thing to do. We have scoring guidelines to make it easier for us to account for the change in aggregate demand, right? Like we have scoring guidelines for a reason. And if we choose that we don't care about them, then we can go into the Wild West. But basically, as George said, like what we want to avoid is where we toggle back and forth to make it look like what we're doing is always free or cheap or whatever. Do whatever you want to do. That's a fine thing. We just want to account for it. And you can always choose to say, cool, I'm doing it anyway. And that's the right of legislators. And if that's reflecting the will of the American people, then they should do that. But we should just be honest about what we're doing. And what we're doing here is trying to avoid that and hide what we're actually doing.
Yeah, so for the first couple of decades of the 21st century, our deficits were effectively subsidized by central banks, both the Federal Reserve engaging in quantitative easing, foreign central banks managing their exchange rates, which created virtually unlimited demand for US dollars, regardless of the interest rate. And so interest rates were very low because central banks didn't care about interest rates. They were buying treasuries at a rapid pace. In the last few years, that has been unwinding. The Fed has shifted into quantitative tightening. Foreign central banks are not adding dollars to their currency reserves like they used to. And as a result, the buyers of treasury debt who are taking their place as that demand drops are bondholders who care about interest rates and want higher returns. That means we are now entering a period where, unlike maybe the first 20 years of the century, higher deficits bondholders are going to require higher interest rates to finance higher deficits. And that is, as Romina said earlier, going to crowd out private investment and be a drag on the economy in a way that it hasn't been before. And to try to address that problem by changing the rules you use to measure the cost of something, it's kind of like trying to solve the grinding sound you hear under the hood of your car by turning up the volume on the radio. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump off something Bobby said, which is what Congress wants, is defining Congress or congressional, the party in power as a whole unit, is they want lower taxes without having to do any painful or unpopular changes to spending, and also lower deficits. These things are inconsistent with each other, and so they're looking for workarounds, right? And one idea is to say, well, the tax cuts pay for themselves through faster economic growth. It's true, tax cuts can pay for some percent of themselves, maybe 10 or 20% or 5% or -1%. That's still a percent, but they're not going to pay for themselves. So then the next strategy is to say, well, someone's going to figure this out later. Elon Musk is going to figure it out, and maybe he will. But you can't take kind of current credit for future unknown actions. And now the strategy is to say, well, the cost is actually zero because we were going to do it anyway. But this is incredibly circular logic. By that definition, anything that you want to do costs zero because you are going to do it anyway. If you worry that as I do, that our high and rising debt is an increasing threat to our economic vibrance and our sustainability, you should worry about a current policy baseline. If you support reductions in spending to programs where you think we're spending too much or not spending efficiently, you should oppose a current policy baseline. If you're concerned that future Congresses, Democratic or Republican, are going to be able to do whatever they want, you should oppose a current policy baseline. And if you kind of believe in the integrity of basic kind of rules and accounting, whether it's the Senate rules or whether it's math, you should oppose the current policy baseline. So my pitch would be that they're looking for an easy way out, and we shouldn't give it to them.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for taking the time to have this really important and interesting discussion, and to the hundreds of people who logged in to listen. Apologies that we weren't able to get to every question. There were just so many different questions. There were also a lot of questions about details more on reconciliation process versus current policy. So I invite everyone to please go to our website. We did a webinar on the reconciliation process 2 weeks ago, and that's the full recording is published on our website at crfb.org/events. We will be publishing the full recording for this as well on that same website. So I invite you to share it around to your colleagues and really raise awareness on this very important issue. So with that, thank you all, and we will see you at our next event.